So I want to talk about when I realized how important this was, and how I'm thinking about genetic engineering now.
Yes.
So it was actually 23 years ago when I was on the U.S. National Security Council, and my then boss and now very close friend, Richard Clarke, was the person who was talking about the threat of terrorism and the threat of actually Al-Qaeda and Osama bin Laden, and nobody would listen. And when 9/11 happened, Dick's very prescient memo was on President Bush's desk. And Dick always used to say that the key to effectiveness and impact was seeing things before other people saw them, seeing around the corner. And so 23 years ago, I really was asking myself that question very deeply. And I kept coming back to this feeling that the genetics and biotech revolutions were going to fundamentally transform our world. So I started educating myself. I'm entirely self-taught in the sciences. I guess I did take a biology class in 10th grade of high school. And when I was ready, I started writing scholarly papers about this. And I was just frustrated because I was writing, I was speaking. And then a member of the United States Congress read one of my articles, asked me to testify. And that started this process, first of doing more, working with the United States government. And then to get my message out, I felt like I needed to reach a broader audience. So I started writing science fiction novels, like you mentioned in your introduction, Toby. And when I was talking to people about the genetics revolution, I could tell that when they heard it from me, a storyteller, all of a sudden they got it, that there was all of this technology, all of the words, DNA, genetics, and people knew it was somehow important. They didn't know the story. And that was when I realized that I needed to write the story of our past, present, and future of a species, as a species. And that's what Hacking Darwin is. And for me as a futurist, I mean, my parents who are watching this show in Kansas City, they're both doctors. And the way you know that they're doctors is you go to their office and you look on the wall and there's a little piece of paper that says you're a doctor. When you're a futurist, which everybody knows it's just kind of a made up title, you better prove yourself every day because otherwise you're just a presentist or a pastist. And so very long time ago, almost 20 years ago, I started mapping out where I thought the genetics and biotech revolutions would head. As a matter of fact, I testified before United States Congress, and it's pretty exactly where we are now. And we're seeing this fundamental transformation across the board, but there are three areas where it's really hitting us. One is the fundamental transformation of our healthcare systems from generalized medicine based on population averages to precision medicine and healthcare, which is what we're moving toward now, to predictive medicine, healthcare, health and life, where from the moment of birth or before, you'll know a lot and your parents will know a lot about your risks and maybe special opportunities. Then the second application will be in do-it-yourself genomics. People already are getting information about ancestry and other things. We're going to get a lot more information that people will feel is relevant to parenting, to even to identity. And then the third area is in its application to assisted reproduction. And that's why I talk about the end of procreative sex over time, because we're going to apply more and more science, not just to baby making, but also to transforming the nature of the babies that we make. As I mentioned before, we already are doing embryo selection. We already have 3 CRISPR babies that we know of. And I write about this in Hacking Darwin. We'll have hundreds within a decade, and we'll have many thousands within 20 years. And what it is to be a human being is a moving target. We've only had this form for about 300,000 years. This was never an evolutionary terminus. We are changing, and we change with our technologies. But all of these technologies raise fundamental ethical issues. And that's why this isn't just a conversation about science. It has to be a conversation about ethics, and a conversation in which everybody has a seat at the table. And that's why these kinds of dialogues are so important.
So let me say hello to Jamie's mum and dad. I'm sure you're no more doubting that Jamie picked a really important topic to work on. I'm reminded the conversation I had with my father when he finally realized, and artificial intelligence became highly topical, that what I've been thinking about for the last 50 years was suddenly very, very important. So let's start with COVID and then broaden out to these bigger topics around genetic engineering. So you've been quite vocal about the idea that most likely it came out of a virology lab in Wuhan as opposed to the wet market. My reading is that, well, it's not, the evidence is that it's probably not man-made at all. The genetic evidence points to it being naturally created, but we'll never probably work out whether that came from a lab or it came from a wet market or wherever. Do you think we'll ever work out? Is it important that we really work out where it came from? I mean, the fact that we know that it is just so dangerous, and will we be able to make even more dangerous viruses in the future? And is that, you mentioned that you started to worry about this when you were working with the National Security Council and terrorists and so on. Should we be worried that terrorists and rogue states are going to come up with even worse viruses?
It's a really great question, Toby. So let me take it point by point. First, and let me say at the outset, I totally and completely disassociate myself with any blame shifting, any racism and bigotry. And this is a really sensitive topic, and a lot of people with ill intentions are poking around here. And so I myself, I've been committed and dedicated most of my life to fighting for human rights. But I do think, as I said in my remarks, that it's actually critically important for us to do our best to figure out where this came from, just as if a plane crashed, we would want to know where that came from. And we need to do it in an evidence-based, thoughtful, smart way. I agree with what you said, that this does not look like it's a genetically altered or engineered virus. Certainly, we will face genetically engineered viruses in the future because it can be done relatively inexpensively. A lab in Canada a few years ago created a horsepox virus, which is a cousin of smallpox. They did it for $100,000. Now that something like that could be done for under $10,000. So we're going to see that in the future, and we have to be worried about it. But here's why it's important to know, to try to know whether this was a natural zoonotic jump or this was an accident, an accidental leak from one of the 2 Chinese virology labs in Wuhan. Because if there is a problem with Chinese lab security, which I believe that there is, and there's a broader problem with just the ethical and regulatory frameworks around Chinese big science, that's a really important issue. That's all of our concern. I mentioned these first 3 CRISPR babies. It's not coincidental that this rogue science had to alter the genome of humans when most everyone else on Earth thought this was unethical, that it happened in China. There is a Chinese science culture, and it's not as careful as it needs to be. So let's look at whether it's a natural jump. If that had been the case, where would that have happened? Because the horseshoe bats, which is the most likely reservoir host for this virus, they're in Yunnan. That's 1,100 miles away from Hubei, from Wuhan. And so if that jump had happened...
The same DNA.
Yes. And so if that jump had happened somewhere else, we would have seen evidence of people who had COVID-19 likely somewhere else. If this jump happened in the seafood market, then it wouldn't make sense that there were the Lancet reports that came out in January suggesting that the cluster from the seafood market wasn't the first cluster. But what if the story is that it came out of one of the 2 virology labs in Wuhan? When this story came out, on day 1, I said, well, this sounds really suspicious because I track China a lot. And I know when they have these breakouts, they happen in the south, in Guangdong or Yunnan, in the more tropical areas. They don't happen in Wuhan or in Hubei, at least historically. They don't have that many bats there, and the bats there are hibernating. but they do have the only level 4 virology lab in Wuhan. And we know that those virology labs were studying bat coronaviruses. And we know that when US Embassy officials visited one of them in 2018, they were appalled by that they were studying these exact type of viruses, and the security was so low. And we know that in the first few weeks after the outbreak, there was a massive cover-up attempt in China where evidence was destroyed. People were forced to retract things. And even now, we don't have that level of openness. So I don't know whether we'll ever know, but it's really important that we know. But then it's also important that we recognize that this is an ongoing threat. And even if and when we get over this crisis, which we will, there are going to be more of them. And that's why we can't accept the world as it is. We can't accept that we have a World Health Organization that doesn't have a global surveillance capability, that doesn't have inspection teams that can immediately go anywhere in the world, that doesn't have the resources and mandate to organize a coordinated global response. We can't accept that we're not working with African countries and South Asian countries and others to build up their public health infrastructures. That world is broken, and worse is coming. The rate of these pathogens showing up is increasing because of climate change, because of ecosystem destruction, because of the ways that we are living. And if we can't build up our defenses and our capacities and help each other, we're in even bigger trouble.